Welcome to the ACI Alliance Tuesday Talks. This webinar is being recorded. Today's session is the second part of a two-part presentation on CI rehab. The first part is up on the website if you missed it. My name is Kelly Flodine, and I'm a CI user. I was bilaterally implanted in 2020. I look back over the past few years and I consider taking that leap of faith and making the jump to cochlear implants as being one of the best decisions that I've ever made in my life. I go where I want to go and talk to who I want to talk to. I got my friends and family back. I make new friends easy. I'm just back to living my life as I know it, and it's priceless. CI rehab has been a favorite topic of mine for the past year. Most of it relates to getting music back in my life. So I'm interested in these sessions with y'all. This talk is part of an ongoing for parents, adults with hearing loss, family members, and others. As a member of the CI the CI Consumer Advocacy Network, I hope that y'all will listen to today's presentation, learn something from it, and consider getting involved in the work of the American Cochlear Implant Alliance. Slide 2. First, we're going to go over some of the technology for the Zoom settings. To access closed captioning, first click on the settings in the navigation panel at the top of the screen. Then under the meeting tab, verify that closed captioning should be enabled. If not, just click on it and enable it. To ask a question, use the chat box and just type your question in. Slide 3. The American Cochlear Implant Alliance is a unique organization that's focused on cochlear implant care across the care continuum. We were founded because it was felt that cochlear implants fall through the cracks at other hearing health organizations, and we wanted to focus attention on improving access to cochlear implants. The mission of the ACI Alliance is to support research, advance awareness, and advocacy. Slide 4. The CI the Consumer Advocacy Network, is for adult consumers and family members of recipients, including the parents. And it's aimed at enhancing and enlarging the broader advocacy efforts with our firsthand knowledge of cochlear implants. Our personal stories can make a difference in impacting decision makers, and it adds credibility with contacts with state and federal representatives on key issues. If you're interested in learning more about the CI just type it in the chat box there, and ACI Alliance staff will follow up with you later. Slide 5. Slide 5 is some website resources that are available on the ACI Alliance website. Now we introduce today's speaker, Lindsay Zombek. She's a certified speech and language pathologist, a listening and spoken language specialist, a certified auditory-verbal therapist. She's a supervisor for speech and language pathology at University Hospitals Cleveland Medical Center. She works with the Cochlear Implant Program, providing oral rehabilitation for children and adults who are deaf or hard of hearing. She's published chapters and articles related to her work with children and adults with hearing loss, and additionally presents and teaches internationally on topics related to oral rehabilitation and hearing loss. Lindsay?
Thank you so much, Kelly. As Kelly said, I'm Lindsay Zombek. I'm so thrilled to be here with you for a second week to talk about some rehabilitation for adults after you get a cochlear implant. Everything today is designed for whether you're considering a cochlear implant or whether you already have a cochlear implant, or if you're just supporting somebody who does have a cochlear implant. We're very lucky to have Kelly moderating for us today. Kelly has personal experience with cochlear implants and is a phenomenal resource in many areas with cochlear implants, but especially in music appreciation, which is one of the areas we're going to be talking about today. So definitely, if you have questions, post your questions. And after we go through the first part of the presentation, we look forward to continuing the discussion with you and sharing some more information. So as we said, this is part 2 of a series on adult oral rehabilitation. So here's some of the topics we talked about last week. There is a recording of the presentation from last week. So if you're interested and missed it, it is available for viewing. Last week, we talked about what auditory training or adult oral rehab really is. We talked about who's a candidate for oral rehabilitation. We discussed things like insurance coverage and started talking about some strategies for developing early communication skills when you're listening with a cochlear implant. Additionally, we talked about some of the resources that are widely available if you have a cochlear implant and are interested on working on listening skills. So for today, and we're not going to cover that again since we did that last time, but today we're going to be talking about some more of the complex listening situations, and we're going to be discussing some tips for things like telephone use, music appreciation, and for listening in noise. So listening in noisy situations like restaurants, meetings. And if you have a hearing loss, you're probably aware that the world is a very noisy place. So we're frequently listening in noise, no matter how quiet we try to make things. So let's get right into it. We're going to start with tips for telephone conversations. It's important to note that telephone conversations can be very challenging initially through a cochlear implant. It's a very complex listening task. It's complex and challenging because oftentimes when we're talking on a telephone or a cell phone, we have poor signals. We don't always hear the other person clearly. There's generally no form of visual cues, so you can't lip read. You may not be able to see what the person's saying. You may not be able to see their body language. So you have to rely solely on listening to participate in a true telephone conversation. There's also filtering that is used by things like cell phones to try to make speech sound better. But when you're listening to a filtered speech sound, it can make it more complex and make it more challenging for listening. And then additionally, when we listen on cell phones or even on landlines, a lot of times there's additional background noise, and it's hard to hear the conversation clearly when we're having all of this background noise. So for all of these reasons and more, it's a very complex listening task and is something that many people have to work on or practice building up listening skills in order to be able to achieve a telephone conversation comfortably and successfully. So in terms of accessing communication on the telephone, there's multiple ways to access a telephone call. Some of this may depend on the cochlear implant you use and what type of technology you have available to you, be it cell phones or landlines or other forms of communication. So one way that some people might use would be streaming directly to a cochlear implant. So with some cochlear implants, you're able to, and some telephones, particularly cell phones, you're able to stream the conversation directly to the cochlear implant. For people who are not familiar with this concept, it's basically turning your cochlear implant into one of those Bluetooth devices that we see people use. It kind of makes your cochlear implant like headphones. So anything that comes through the cell phone is played through your cochlear implant directly. You don't have to hold the phone up to your ear at all. You're able to hear what's coming through the cell phone directly in your cochlear implant. So, some hearing combinations allow you to use telecoil, which is another way of putting the sound directly into your cochlear implant and enabling you to hear the conversation better. Some people just use their regular cell phone or their regular landline phone and hold it up to the cochlear implant microphone. It's important to remember in that situation that for a lot of people after a cochlear implant, you have to think about where your microphones are on your cochlear implant. So you don't want to hold up the telephone receiver directly to your ear unless you have a microphone that's in your ear. Otherwise, you want to hold up the phone to the microphones on the cochlear implant so that you're able to hear that conversation better. A lot of people end up liking how speakerphone sounds. So taking your phone, whether it's a landline or a cell phone, and putting it on speakerphone, some people feel that they're able to hear the conversation the best and the clearest when the phone's in speakerphone mode. And then there's also the use of caption phones. And with caption phones, this would be a way of being able to see the words that the other person is saying while you're listening to the conversation. The caption phones come in a lot of different styles and designs. A lot of areas you're able to get them free or at reduced costs. And there's definitely some pros to using a caption phone and getting the conversation printed as it happens. So in terms of improving communication for telephone use, it's important to remember the reasons why telephone calls are hard. So to be able to successfully talk on the telephone without something like captions, you must be able to hold a conversation without any visual cues and without any kind of lip reading, or sometimes it's called speech reading. You've got to be able to listen and hear the conversation. If that's something you're still working on, then it's going to probably be very challenging to understand a telephone call through a cochlear implant. And working on being able to listen and understand a conversation without visual cues may be a good place to start to be able to understand what you're hearing on the phone better. We did discuss some ways of learning how to listen to sentences and conversation in our last session, our part 1. So if you need a little more information on that, please go back and check out part 1 as well. In general, you have to work to build up your ability to understand conversations through listening. And if you're struggling with that, I'd really highly recommend considering some form of speech to text or captioning services for the phone. If you're not able to follow that conversation, it'll allow you to see what's being said. Some people like to use captioning services or speech to text services, even when they are understanding well on the phone, just to make sure that they didn't miss a key detail. So we have to build up those listening skills and have good listening skills without visual cues generally to have a successful telephone call. Certainly that changes if you're using something like FaceTime or something else where you're able to see the person's face. But for a standard cell phone or landline telephone call, it's helpful if you're able to understand conversation without being able to have a visual cue. To practice telephone conversations, certainly it can be challenging with how do you practice these telephone conversations, because a lot of times it's uncomfortable to make a telephone call when you know it's something that's going to be challenging, and it can be somewhat stressful for people to practice telephone conversations because they don't want to miss information. You certainly don't want to try to call the doctor's office and miss the correct day or time of the appointment you just made. So there's many different ways that you can practice telephone conversations that are no pressure situations. So you're able to practice and you don't have to have that stress of worrying about, oh, what, what if I miss something? So we'll go through some of those things. I encourage you to look at the various cochlear implant manufacturers' websites. The manufacturers all have different programs and ways for targeting telephone conversations that allow you to practice listening on the telephone in a no pressure situation. A lot of them have recorded messages or phone numbers that you can call with recorded messages that allow you to practice the skills you need for listening on the phone without having to first make that conversation. Get to the point where you feel comfortable first before you're having the conversation. These are great resources. They're free resources. So I highly encourage you to go to the various manufacturers. The major manufacturers in the United States, Advanced Bionics, Cochlear Corporation, and Med-El all have things, and you're welcome to check out any of the websites and see what they have to help you with listening on the phone. If you are interested in having a conversation with someone and you have a listening partner available to you, the nice thing about practicing telephone conversations is your listening partner doesn't have to be living in the same place as you and doesn't have to be in the house at the same time as you. So establish with a listening partner. So this is going to be somebody who's going to help you work on your listening. Establish with them a known topic and have a phone call. So for example, you might start with categories. I'm going to give you a call, and the listening partner might say, I'm going to give you specific categories. For example, I'm going to say words of things that could be toppings for pizza. So when I call, I want you to listen for words that are pizza toppings. And then you call and you can give all your favorite pizza toppings, and the person who is using the cochlear implant can try to repeat back the words that they're hearing. You can do this with a lot of different categories. If you're getting to the point where that's way too easy, then maybe you can do something where you have a listening partner read an article to you, where you have a copy of the article as well. So you both have the same newspaper article, or you both have the same magazine article, or the same book, and the listening partner reads and the person with the cochlear implant reads along at the same time. So getting to hear the voice and being able to pair it up visually with what you're seeing is a great way to help the brain make connections. And we'll be talking about making some of these brain connections even more, especially when we get into the music kind of thing and the music appreciation material. But reading and listening at the same time. If that gets too easy, you can stop looking at the article or the book in front of you and just listen. And I always tell people, go back and check if you do that and make sure you are accurate, because we don't know what we don't know. And so our brains might tell us we heard something correctly, but we may have misheard a name or misheard a detail, or maybe just missed something completely. And we don't know that if we don't go back and look. So it's important to always go back if you're just listening and aren't reading along, to make sure that you heard what you thought you heard. If you're feeling pretty confident with listening to categories, with listening to articles or a story that's being read, then some people feel comfortable doing some role playing on the phone and playing certain scenarios that are likely phone calls. So for example, you may call and say that your listening partner is the scheduler for a doctor's office. So what types of questions might a scheduler ask you? Those are all really important things and great ways to practice and get you hearing different sentences and conversations that are likely to be said. You can do that with carry out for food. You could do that with calling for insurance questions. You could practice calling somebody to establish a meeting time or an invitation to a restaurant. So you can practice some of these conversations in advance in this no pressure, no stress situation. And that way you're more prepared for when it's time to have the real conversation. One big area in telephone communication is knowing and using repair strategies. So a repair strategy is something you can do to either prevent a mistake from happening when you're listening, or to fix a mistake even before it becomes a big mistake. So there's different ways you can prevent mistakes from happening when you're listening on the phone, since we know that listening on the telephone is going to be a complicated listening challenge for a lot of people. One thing is, make sure you're asking for repetition. Remember, you can't see the other person, but they also can't see you. So they're not going to be able to read your body language. They're not going to know if you're feeling a little confused or unsure about something you heard. They're not going to know that you did not understand something and are probably going to assume you did. So make sure you're asking for repetition when you don't hear something so that you can get that message again. It's also important to take charge of the communication situation by telling the person on the phone how you need them to speak in order for you to hear. A lot of times people tell me that they'll tell somebody on the phone, well, I have a hearing loss. The problem is that for whatever reason, humans are not great at just intuitively knowing how to speak to somebody who has a hearing loss or who is deaf or hard of hearing. So we may have to help people by telling them exactly what we need. Sometimes that's to talk louder, but sometimes we end up in scenarios where people are just screaming back at us, and screaming doesn't help us with understanding. Sometimes you actually need somebody to speak a little bit softer. So making sure you tell somebody that I need you to change your volume. Could you be a little bit louder? Could you please be a little softer when you're talking? The other thing to pay attention to is the speed at which people are talking. There are some situations where they actually need to talk faster. Most of the time, though, we have to tell people that we need them to talk a little bit slower. And slowing down how quickly someone's talking just gives you more time to process the information and to make sure you heard it and had a chance to understand it before they continue on. Also, it's important to be asking for clarifying information. So if you have an important detail, such as there's an appointment, the day and time, then it's good to just clarify. The appointment's at 3 o'clock on Tuesday, correct? Just to make sure you heard it correctly. Then if you didn't hear it, somebody will tell you, oh, no, it's at 2 o'clock, and they can help fix it. Because remember that numbers and names can be hard to hear, but they carry a lot of valuable information. So it's very good to just anticipate clarifying anything that's numbers or names to make sure that you heard it and got it down correctly. A final suggestion in the telephone repair strategies would be, instead of asking what, repeat the parts that you did hear. And the reason for that is if you just say what to somebody, they're going to repeat back all of what they just said. And you're going to have to listen to a lot of information again, some of which you already heard. And the information you want is still going to be buried in a long sentence. If you repeat what you did hear, for example, I heard the appointment is on Tuesday, but I didn't hear what time you said. Then the person's only going to repeat the time, and you don't have to listen to the whole sentence again. And it just makes communication a lot easier. So I want to move out of telephone conversations and move into music appreciation. So why are we even talking about music? So I like this quote. Music is a pervasive form of communication that exists in all known cultures. Music is an emotionally expressive and a culturally significant acoustic phenomenon that helps regulate mood, connects us with important memories, and fosters social cohesiveness throughout the lifespan. So basically, this is saying that no matter where people live, no matter their culture, their background, no matter their age, that there's a lot that happens with music that is significant in various groups. It's significant to how we feel. It's significant to our memories, and it's significant to our relationships with other people. Music is very important in a lot of different ways. Americans spend more money on music annually than on prescription drugs even. Music is very important to people. The average American adolescent listens to an average of 105,000 hours of popular music each year. That's a lot of music. People spend a lot of time listening to music. The challenge is that people can have different experiences with music when they have a cochlear implant. I've seen everything from people being told music is not going to sound good through a cochlear implant to music is not going to sound good, but you can work at it and it's going to eventually sound good, to people saying, music sounds great through my cochlear implant. There's a lot of different experiences with music. So what we do see from looking at the research and just from anecdotal working with adults who get cochlear implants, there's a lot of areas in music and understanding and appreciating music that are challenging through a cochlear implant, but there's a lot of these areas that can be improved when we directly target it. Some of the areas that can make music challenging through a cochlear implant include that it can be challenging to recognize a melody through a cochlear implant. There's some challenges for people with understanding or identifying the timbre of instruments. Timbre is the voice of an instrument. It's the reason why you could have a piano, a guitar, and a trumpet all play the song Happy Birthday and play it with the exact same musical notes, but you'll know that one is a piano and one's a guitar and one is a trumpet because each instrument has its own voice. Humans also have their own voices. It's how if somebody calls you and you don't see them, you know exactly who's on the phone and they can say, hey, it's me. And you know from their voice that it's them. It's the reason I was on another Zoom call with over 500 people and somebody started speaking, and without looking at the screen, I knew exactly who was asking the question because I knew that person's voice. I was able to recognize that timbre of their voice. So timbre is very important. And at first with a cochlear implant, a lot of people experience challenges with hearing the different voices of the instruments. Some people also have challenges with pitch recognition. So pitch is something that is often challenging, especially when you first get a cochlear implant. From a conversation standpoint, we see some pitch challenges in areas of some challenges with understanding different vowels. Vowels sound maybe more similar, but we also hear it that adults report sometimes that it's hard to tell if somebody's speaking as a man or a woman because their voice kind of sounds the same. Or they might report that I can hear men's voices much better than I can hear a woman's voice. So sometimes our pitch recognition plays a huge role in both our understanding of conversation, but then has a huge impact in music when we're not picking up the different pitches and the different notes. It's hard to make music sound like music if you're not hearing pitch. Another area in music appreciation is the understanding of lyrics or the words to a song. Now, lyrics are very challenging, whether or not you're deaf or hard of hearing. Lyrics can be very challenging because singers intentionally change how a sound or a word sounds in order to have it fit into either a rhythm scheme they need, or to fit, to make it rhyme with a word that maybe it doesn't rhyme with. My brother teases me all the time because there was a song and I had to ask him, I said, I don't understand what that word is. What is a faha? And my brother was like, you know, a faha. And I said, no, I'm not familiar with that word. I don't know what a faha is. And he kept laughing at me and teasing me. And finally, he told me, Lindsay, the word in the song is far, but in the song, to make it fit, the singer was pronouncing the word faha. And it worked in the song, but it made it so that I had no idea what that word was supposed to be. So lyric comprehension can be challenging in general, but if you're already struggling to understand words or understand sentences, if you're having trouble listening in noisy situations, lyrics are basically sentences or paragraphs with background noise, with all of this music happening. So lyric comprehension can be very challenging. Some people just feel that they don't enjoy music as much through a cochlear implant, and it probably goes back to a lot of these other areas. The nice thing is that we do see, again, in research and in just general working with adults who are deaf and hard of hearing who use cochlear implants, that when we focus on these specific areas, that adults can progress to appreciating music more than they did originally, or some people get full music appreciation and really enjoy listening to music through their cochlear implants. So we talked a little bit about how music and speech are going to go hand in hand. So as your speech skills and listening skills for speech develop, sometimes you'll see that your understanding and appreciation of music gets better. Sometimes we see the reverse. As people are understanding and appreciating music more, we see some changes in how much they're understanding speech. And that's because a lot of the words and areas we target in comprehending speech and in listening to and appreciating music end up being very similar. They have different words for the same thing. So in speech, we talk about frequency of sounds. In music, that's pitch. But frequency and pitch are essentially the same thing. In speech, we talk about duration, the length of things. But in music, that's the tempo or the rhythm of a song. We look at intensity, which in music would be volume and dynamics and accents. We talk about tone in speech, and that's the timbre or that voice again in music. And then we talk about prosody, kind of how the musicality and how our voice flows. An example of prosody would be, you know, when somebody isn't using good prosody, if their speech is very staccato and they talk in bursts, or we try to see, we expect, you know, certain, with questions, for example, that our voice will raise up at the end. But if I'm making a statement, it won't. But all of this is the same thing as melodic contour. So a lot of these areas go hand in hand, and we end up developing similar skills at the same time. For music appreciation in general, there's a lot of different tips and things I recommend for people to try. And certainly this is not an exhaustive list, but it's a start. So one thing is to try different ways of actually listening to music. Some people prefer the sound quality and the sound that they get of music when they stream it directly to their cochlear implant. When it's not coming through speakers, because speakers could potentially distort the sound and the music a little bit more. So if it's not coming through speakers, it might sound better. And people might have better control over the volume, and there's a lot of reasons why streaming it might end up being beneficial. Some people, however, do prefer how it sounds through their microphones. They feel they get a richer, fuller sound through just listening through the microphone, so not a direct stream. It allows, if you have hearing in your contralateral ear, to be getting the natural sounding music through the other ear as well. So sometimes people end up preferring it without direct stream. I encourage people to try multiple types of music, because music, especially if it's sounding different to you through your cochlear implant, you might find that a different type of music allows you to understand the music or appreciate and like that music a little bit more. So I've worked with one gentleman who really liked rock music before his cochlear implant, but afterwards he ended up liking jazz better through his cochlear implant. It had fewer instruments, it sounded crisper and clearer to him, and he got more enjoyment of that. So try some different types of music and see how they sound through your cochlear implant. It's important to determine what is challenging through the cochlear implant and target that specific area. So if you're not picking up something like the rhythm and you're just hearing noise, focusing on picking up the rhythm and the beat of a song might be a good place to start. There's a lot of great support for really working on pitch. And that would be trying to hear different pitches. It may be initially low pitches versus high pitches, but you can actually target that by using different instruments to see if you're able to hear sounds that are closer together. So if you don't have access to instruments at home, there's a lot of free apps you can get, or different things you can get for your computer, where you could get, for example, a free keyboard, and some of the keyboards will even have different instrument sounds, so you can listen to pitch and you can see if you're working on a keyboard, for example, can I hear the difference between the two sounds when they're eight different keys away? Can I hear, do they sound different when they're 5? Do they sound different when they're 3 or 2? And start working on being able to hear the pitch. If you're working on, or if you're hearing the music, but you feel like you're losing all of the words, then you can target lyrics specifically. So for example, you might read along with a song. The nice thing these days is that if you go on the internet and type in the name of the song, you'll be able to get the lyrics for almost any song. So it's very helpful to be able to read along and listen to it, then go back and listen to it and see if you're able to still hear it when you don't have the lyrics in front of you. I do recommend too that people spend some time trying to learn that timbre, that voice of each instrument. And to do that, I would focus on the instruments that are found in the music types you like. So if you like rock music versus jazz versus bluegrass versus orchestral type music, you're going to have different instruments. So think about the instruments that you're going to be listening to the most and try focusing on those maybe as an individual instrument first. If you go on the internet, go to something like YouTube, if you type in guitar solo, you're going to get millions of videos of people playing their guitar, so that you'd have the opportunity to listen to a lot of different types of guitars and just listen to the voice of that instrument. In general, with music and practicing with music, the more you listen to music, is going to be a lot stronger. And so there's apps, there's programs, there's different things you can do, but there's a lot of value in spending the time with music and actually listening to music and listening to a lot of music. So part of it's going to be hard work but patience and continuing to listen to music, even if it isn't sounding good at first. Maybe listen to some songs that you already knew. Your brain may already know some of those songs, and it might help you with hearing it how it's intended to be heard than through your cochlear implant. Some people find they're more successful trying songs that they didn't have a memory of, so new songs, so that you're not trying to say, I know what that sounds like, but it sounds different now. So there's a lot of different ways that you can target music and start with doing that. If your brain is familiar with music, if you've had more experience with music before your cochlear implant, then a lot of times people find that it's easier to get back into music after a cochlear implant. The brain uses so many different regions in order to understand music and to listen to music. So there's some really great connections, especially if you have a good history with music. So tap into that, and hopefully that then leads to understanding music a little bit better through the cochlear implant. Oops. So the different cochlear implant manufacturer sites do have tips or programs for developing music skills. And as I said, make sure you're just listening to music. Tap out the rhythm, see if you can recognize melodies, but really practice listening to music. If you're musically inclined, play a lot of music. That can really help. I do want to move into listening and noise quickly. For listening and noise, maybe the most frequently reported challenge that I hear when I'm talking with an adult who is deaf or hard of hearing. So adults who are very successful with conversations sometimes find that when you go somewhere and there's a lot of noise, it becomes a lot harder to listen. Ranging anywhere from a lot harder to impossible. So it's certainly harder for everybody, but if you have a hearing loss, then that's often associated with more challenges in noisy environments. Many people do better in noise when they have a cochlear implant than what they were doing with their hearing aid, but there are things that we can do. We know it's challenging, but there are things we can do to make listening and noise better and easier for people. So one of the first things we can do would be some environmental modifications. And what I mean by that is, what can we do to change things around us so we can create the best possible listening situation that we can in any given scenario? So one of the things is we want to get rid of distance. Distance is a huge enemy of listening. So we want to get as close to the person that we want to hear as we can. That might be by sitting next to the person we want to hear the most, if we're going to a restaurant or sitting around a Thanksgiving table. That might be using some form of FM, DM, or remote microphone technology to make sure people's voices are being heard more clearly over background sound. It's also important to look in any situation, are there sounds that can be turned off or minimized in some way? So the kitchen is a very noisy place. Even those super quiet dishwashers make a lot of noise. So don't have a conversation when the dishwasher is running. Step out of the room to have that conversation. The refrigerator might be humming. There's other noises around the house. If there's a television on, then let's pause that show or turn the TV off for a minute to have important conversations. So turning off what we can and minimizing when we can't. So to minimize it, for example, somebody might do better sitting more towards a corner of a restaurant versus in the middle of a bunch of noisy tables. Be familiar with the settings that exist on your hearing aid or cochlear implant that can help you in noise. Sometimes they're programmed in ways to help reduce noise around you, and being familiar with those settings, when to use them and how to use them, can help with making the listening environment a little more favorable for listening. So here's an example. If we're talking about restaurants, think about making reservations ahead of time and have a conversation with the person and ask for a table that's going to be away from the kitchen. If you're by the kitchen, then it's going to be a lot harder to hear. A table in the corner may be more beneficial because then there's not noise coming from behind you or to the sides of you. You're just dealing with the noise in front of you. You don't want tables that are going to be near service stations where the restaurant staff is going to quickly go to drop silverware or dishes or grab things, because that's going to be very noisy. You don't want a table that's right next to speakers or by a band if there's a band somewhere, because that's going to make things a lot harder to hear if music is blaring. And consider things like, can you go a little bit earlier or a little bit later to not have the restaurant be quite as busy, to be able to hear a little bit better, to control some of those noise factors. You're not going to be able to control all of them, but if you can control some of them, you might set yourself up with a little more success with listening and noise. So some of what you can do is go back and look at part 1. We talked about a lot of communication exercises. What we can do to practice listening skills and noise is repeat a lot of those conversational and communication exercises, but do them again, and this time adding noise, such as a TV or a radio at the same time. So recalling words from a known category, like we talked about before with the telephone. So if we say, I'm going to say some animals, and you repeat what animal you heard. However, you want the TV on or radio on at the same time, so that you're having to focus on the voice that you want to hear, even when all that other noise and talking is happening. You can repeat a sentence about a picture you're looking at with somebody else, or you can repeat a common phrase. Again, you can use some of those things that we talked about, the telephone use, like situations like doctor's offices or restaurants. Listen for those type of conversations and phrases, but do that with TV on or a radio on. When you are able, you're starting that super soft, and as you're getting like 80% of them correct or so, make sure you turn the volume up a little bit. And then when you're being very successful again, turn that volume up a little bit higher. You might have to start soft and slowly work your way up. You can also have your listening partner read a sentence from a book with background noise. And that background noise might be music or TV. It might be something like the dishwasher, if the dishwasher is noisy. But they read a sentence and you repeat back what you've heard. After you've done words and you've done sentences, then you want to practice paragraphs. You can have a whole conversation with somebody trying to do it intentionally in noise. You can have your listening partner read an entire paragraph or a page of something, and then you can either summarize what you heard or they can ask you questions about it to make sure you're hearing that conversation. And again, with all of these, you're going to start with soft noise and increase as your abilities increase. You're going to make it harder by making the noise louder. There are some tips for overcoming challenges of listening and noise with the cochlear implant. Donna Sorkin of the American Cochlear Implant Alliance, and I have this tips for overcoming the challenges of listening and noise with a cochlear implant. There's a free copy available online. If you just search for that title, it'll pop up. That was in the Hearing Journal, so that can be a resource if you're looking for some additional quick tips. And in general, I just wanted to remind people that there's all these different areas and individual programs that you can use to practice music appreciation, listening and noise, and telephone skills. We see all these areas improve with structured practice. And if you're feeling like you don't know what to do next, or you're working on it and you don't feel like you're making the progress you want to see, or if you just need some tips of how to get started, look for somebody who provides oral rehabilitation, some form of oral rehabilitation provider, and they can help you with setting up a program very specific to your personal needs to help you work in these areas. So I want to make sure we have some time for questions here. And also, as I mentioned before, we are so fortunate to have Kelly with us, who has gone through and continues to go through music appreciation type exercises and things. And so I definitely want to give everyone a chance to hear some of Kelly's experiences, but then also to ask any questions you have. So I think you have, there's the chat area, but there's also an area called Q&A. So if you have any questions that you'd like to discuss, please put them in there. And Kelly, I'll be quiet now and let you take over.
I appreciate it. That was a good presentation, and you really hit on a lot of the music stuff that I feel is extremely important, not just for getting music back in our life, but it's probably the most important part of CI rehab, especially I've talked for myself, is that my audiologist in my evaluation told me that a good CI outcome is 90% our brain and our effort, and maybe 10% the hardware they stick in our head. So I really believe her after these past couple of years. And when I first got activated, I picked up speech pretty quickly. It was very robotic and strange sounding, but I understood immediately much better than I did with my hearing aids. But music was disastrously bad. It was unrecognizable noise. And I played guitar since I was a kid, and I would put a playlist on of old familiar songs that I sang from years ago, and I'd put it on random and just try to understand which song was coming out, and it was impossible. So occasionally a word or a guitar riff would pop out of the mix, and my brain would latch onto it, and my music memory would fill in the blanks, and I could follow the song along. So that was one of my first rehab experiences. Then I got talking with my audiologist, and she gave me some open programs, just all the sound noise reduction turned off and all the auto features turned off, and it opened the dynamic range up a little bit, and I started hearing music better. So I get up here in my room and play guitar, and I would play scales up the neck, and it would sound like I was playing the same note over and over again. Or worse, I would be playing an ascending scale and it would flip around and go back down backwards. So I just would play every night up here, and sure enough, your brain starts filling in the gaps and it starts stepping up. And the way cochlear implants process sound, the fine structure and the harmonic mathematics that give our brain a sense of timbre and pitch are lost to us as cochlear implant users. So we have to retrain our brain to figure out new ways of getting a sense of pitch. And by playing a guitar or an instrument of any kind, the music memory that we have, the muscle memory, the motor movements that you make, and feeling the vibrations off of the instrument gives our brain just tons of extra information to determine how to figure out how we can get a sense of pitch back. So when you do get that sense of pitch, then it makes everything, just like you were saying in your presentation, it makes everything so much easier environmental sound so much more normal. You can focus on the fundamental frequency of a voice and lock in on it and ignore other noise, which makes hearing in noise so much easier. And
Absolutely.
yeah, it's amazing what your brain can do.
Very true.
Even missing all that critical information, it figures out a way of doing it if you put the effort into doing it.
Right. So Kelly, one of the questions in the Q&A section was for you, and people were wondering, I mean, would you say at this point that you hear music well? I mean, do you enjoy listening to music with your cochlear implants?
Yes, I do. Now, at first it was awful, but I knew that I needed to listen to lots of music intentionally for it to ever get back right. So I work in very noisy circumstances. I do welding fabrication, and it's very noisy. So I just turn Spotify on, put playlists on, turn my mics off, and I listen to 8 or 10 hours of music a day. And it was very bad. I tried many different genres, and some of them come through cochlear implants much better than others. So I like simple music. I like old outlaw country, lots of heavy rock and roll, old gut bucket blues. So any of that simple music with a heavy backbeat comes across very good. I never liked EDM, but I tried some of it, and I tell you, it is almost exactly normal sounding. There's just a heavy beat, no melody to it, and I hate to admit it, but I put it on sometimes and listen to it all day. But I hear music very good now. I hear it. It's nothing exactly like what I used to hear. So the timbre is much different. It's got a little harder edge to everything. I play my old Les Paul over here. I know how that guitar is supposed to sound, and I know how that rig sounds because it's 40 years of listening to it. And I play it now, and I can follow it along, but it sounds like a different rig completely. But it's good. So the main thing right there is the perspective. If I listen to music now and compare it to my memory of music from 40 years ago, I could be very disappointed in it. But if I listen to music now and compare it to the last, say, 10 years of listening to it with my hearing aids, I'm ecstatic with where I'm at right now. So that is that's a big critical factor in being happy with your cochlear implant. I just try to hear music the best that I possibly can with my cochlear implants and work on it every day. And I made huge changes in the first 6 months to a year, but then it's been gradually better as time goes on. And I think it will continue to get better.
Thank you for that. And somebody has a question in the Q&A that you might be able to contribute to as well. They're asking about pitch recognition. Like, so if you want to be in a choir and you have to make sure that your voice is going to match the rest of the groups, or if you're playing an instrument where you have to match and everything, how is the best way to practice and make sure you're actually in tune, you're hitting the right pitch? I mean, I know there's certain there's free apps and things like that you can get to do
Yes.
pitch matching to make sure, but I would say that there's a lot of value in working on actually hearing specific pitches and making sure you're hearing the difference between pitches that are really close, because you can't in the heat of the moment in a choir situation rely on checking a pitch machine or some kind of pitch monitor to make sure that you're hitting pitch. But I would say it's important to practice being able to hear pitches and hear the difference first so that you're able to self-monitor a little bit more. But Kelly, what was your experience? Because I know you did a lot with pitch and making sure you could hear pitch well.
So pitch, in my opinion, is the holy grail, because timbre doesn't matter too much if you can hear, and these things do very fine with rhythm, and so pitch is the hard thing. And I think, in my opinion, playing an instrument is the best out of every rehab tool that I've tried. Playing guitar for me, or whatever instrument, even if you never played an instrument before, you can get it. And everybody knows a do re mi, the major scale, and so you just learn how to play that and play it, and the movement of your hand, and watching it and listening to that familiar scale will help your brain lock in and start stepping to the correct interval. The intervals are really tough. So I think playing guitar or a piano or a keyboard, whatever it is, and just get a scale that you're very familiar with hearing, or a melody, and just play it repeatedly. It can be the same thing, and just play it every night. And then I got there's an app out there that I like called Perfect Ear, and it has scales recognition and interval recognition in all keys, in all octaves, and you can score yourself on it. And I got that probably 6 months in, and started running through it and missed everything. It was just as like chance. But now I can do very well on most of them. You can, another way, it'll pinpoint the intervals that you have problems with, right down to the octave and the interval that you have problems with. So I know in the second octave that I have a really hard time distinguishing between a minor and a major third. And the minor third always sounds like it's a little bit higher than the major third in the second octave for some reason. So I know that that's a sticky point, but it doesn't really bother me when I'm playing guitar. But if you're trying to sing along, that could cause problems if the people around you care that much. So when we're jamming, we don't really care about how refined we are.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Kelly. Gosh, I could talk to you all day, because
I know
you have such a great perspective on this, and I want to learn more and more from you. But I recognize too that we've hit our time, and I know people have to be jumping off and everything. So thank you so much for your contributions and for sharing your story. I think that really helps people who have cochlear implants or who are thinking about getting them understand what kind of needs to happen in order to appreciate music better. But then certainly gives people who are supporting people, whether they're professionals or loved ones and friends, gives them some ideas of how to support as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Lindsay. It was really good meeting you, and I really enjoyed the presentation. You hit on lots of good points that'll be a good resource for people going forward.
Well, thank you. Looks like we have a couple of ACI Alliance resources here. If people are interested, you can go to the website and get some more information for ACIA, the American Cochlear Implant Alliance, on all these different areas. And thank you everybody so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure talking with you all.
Thank you, Lindsay. And thank you so much, Kelly. Thank you to everyone for joining us. Please feel free to take our survey. I put that in the chat. Thank you for joining us, and please join us next month for our last webinar of the series.